In the heart of London, where history meets modernity, stood a young man named James Carter. He was no ordinary individual. He was a member of the Queen's Guard, tasked with protecting one of the most iconic symbols of British tradition, Buckingham Palace. Every morning, tourists from all over the world gathered outside the palace gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the famous guards in their red tunics and towering bearskin hats. Among them was James, standing tall and proud, his posture impeccable as if carved from stone. James wasn't just any guard. Behind his calm exterior lay years of hard work, discipline, and sacrifice. Born into a modest family in South London, he grew up facing challenges that would have broken many. His journey to becoming a royal guard was not easy. It required countless hours of training, physical endurance, and mental strength. But James had something special, an unshakable determination to rise above circumstances. For him, being part of the Queen's Guard wasn't just a job, it was a dream come true, a chance to represent his country and make his family proud. On this particular autumn morning, the air was crisp and the streets buzzed with life. Families posed for photos, children giggled excitedly, and cameras clicked non-stop as people tried to capture the grandeur of the palace and its stoic protectors. James stood motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, adhering strictly to protocol. The crowd admired his dedication, whispering comments like, "Look how still he is," or "How do they stand there for so long without moving?" Some even clapped softly when he shifted positions during the ceremonial march, a rare moment of movement that felt almost magical to onlookers. But what the crowd didn't know was that beneath James' polished exterior, his mind was alert, constantly scanning his surroundings. Being a royal guard meant more than looking regal. It meant staying vigilant, ready to respond to any situation, big or small. Whether it was guiding a lost tourist, preventing someone from climbing the fence, or handling unexpected disturbances, James knew his role extended beyond standing still. It was about embodying duty, honor, and service. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden rays across the courtyard, James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. This was his city, his home, and he was playing a part in safeguarding its legacy. Yet, little did he know, today would bring a challenge unlike anything he had faced before. Amidst the laughter and chatter of the crowd, there lurked someone whose intentions were far from innocent. Someone who saw James not as a symbol of unity and tradition, but as a target for their own prejudices. The stage was set, the players in place, while James remained focused on his duty, oblivious to the brewing storm. Fate was about to test his resolve in ways he could never have imagined. Little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary day would become a story etched in memory, not just for James, but for everyone who witnessed it unfold. Amidst the lively crowd outside Buckingham Palace stood a man who couldn't have been more out of place. His name was Victor Langley, and while everyone else marveled at the grandeur of the palace and the discipline of the guards, Victor carried an air of disdain that seemed almost tangible. Dressed in an expensive suit, his polished shoes gleaming under the autumn sun, he looked like someone who belonged in a boardroom rather than among tourists snapping photos. But appearances can be deceiving, and beneath Victor's well-tailored exterior lay a heart filled with bitterness and prejudice. Victor had always prided himself on his wealth and status, but his ego masked deep insecurities. He believed the world owed him something, and when things didn't go his way, he lashed out, often at those he deemed inferior. To him, authority figures represented everything wrong with society: rules, order, and tradition, all concepts he despised. And today, as he glared at the stoic figure of Private James Carter standing guard, his resentment reached new heights. What angered Victor most wasn't just the presence of the royal guard, it was who the guard was. James, a young black soldier, stood tall and proud, embodying everything Victor hated. In his twisted mind, James' uniform didn't symbolize patriotism or service. It mocked Victor's narrow worldview. How dare someone like him stand so confidently in a position of respect? The very sight made Victor's blood boil. clutching the leash of his massive German shepherd. "Brutus," Victor muttered under his breath, barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "Disgraceful," he spat quietly, his lips curling into a sneer. "They let anyone wear that uniform these days." Brutus, sensing his master's tension, growled low in his throat, straining against the leash. Trained to intimidate rather than obey, the dog mirrored Victor's hostility. With muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat, Brutus was a formidable creature, bred for power and aggression. Tourists nearby instinctively stepped back, giving the pair a wide berth. There was something unsettling about the way Victor gripped the leash, his knuckles white with anger, as though he were itching to unleash chaos. As the minutes passed, Victor's frustration grew. Watching James stand motionless, unwavering in his duty, only fueled his rage. Here was this man, calm and composed, seemingly untouched by the jeers and stares aimed at him earlier that day. It infuriated Victor. How could someone remain so dignified in the face of what he considered ridicule? To Victor, James' composure felt like a personal affront, a challenge to his warped sense of superiority. And then, an idea began to form in Victor's mind. A cruel smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he glanced down at Brutus. The dog whimpered softly, sensing his master's shift in mood. Victor tightened his grip on the leash, his eyes narrowing as he stared at James. "Let's see how brave you really are," he murmured, his voice dripping with malice. Without another thought, Victor decided to act. This wasn't just about hating authority anymore. It was about proving a point. If he could humiliate the guard, if he could show everyone watching that James wasn't as strong or fearless as he appeared, then maybe, just maybe, he could reclaim some of the control he felt slipping away. The crowd continued to buzz around him, oblivious to the storm brewing in Victor's mind. No one noticed the subtle change in his demeanor, the way his body tensed as he prepared to strike. All they saw was a man walking his dog, blending into the background of an ordinary day. But Victor wasn't ordinary, and neither were his intentions. What happened next would leave an indelible mark, not just on James, but on everyone present. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Victor Langley took a step forward, his grip tightening on Brutus' leash. The massive German shepherd growled low, its sharp teeth glinting in the sunlight as it strained against its master's hold. Tourists nearby instinctively backed away, sensing that something was about to happen. Children clung to their parents, and even the chatter of excited visitors began to fade into an uneasy silence. All eyes were now fixed on Victor and his dog, though no one could predict what would come next. Victor's lips curled into a cruel smirk as he glanced at James, who remained perfectly still, standing tall in his red tunic and bearskin hat. To anyone watching, James seemed oblivious to the danger brewing just a few feet away. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead, unwavering, as protocol demanded. But inside, every muscle in his body was alert. Years of training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but there was no denying the rising tension. He could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, hear the restless shuffle of feet, and sense the energy radiating from Victor and his dog. Then, without warning, Victor yanked the leash sharply, releasing Brutus with a single command: "Get him." The words cut through the quiet like a knife, sending a ripple of shock through the onlookers. With a snarl, Brutus lunged forward, charging toward James with terrifying speed. The dog's powerful legs propelled it across the pavement, its jaws snapping menacingly as it closed the distance between them. Gasps erupted from the crowd as people scrambled to get out of the way, some shielding their children while others froze in disbelief. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. James stood motionless, his heart pounding but his expression unchanged. This was not how things were supposed to go. Guards weren't trained for situations like this. They were drilled to maintain discipline, to ignore distractions, and to protect the palace above all else. Yet here was a snarling beast bearing down on him, its teeth bared and its eyes wild with aggression. Instinct screamed at James to react, but years of conditioning held him steady. Just as Brutus reached him, leaping into the air with a ferocious bark, James moved with precision. In one fluid motion, he stepped back slightly and raised his ceremonial rifle, using the bayonet attachment to create a barrier between himself and the dog. The sharp metal gleamed in the sunlight, forcing Brutus to halt mid-attack. The dog snapped wildly, inches away from James' boots, but the guard kept it at bay with practiced control. His movements were deliberate, calculated, not a trace of panic or fear visible on his face. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to cheer or scream. Some covered their mouths in horror, while others reached for their phones to capture the surreal scene unfolding before them. No one expected this, a man in full military regalia fending off a raging animal with nothing but his weapon and sheer willpower. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a clash of raw aggression versus disciplined composure. Victor, meanwhile, looked on with a twisted grin, clearly pleased with himself. This was exactly the reaction he had hoped for: chaos, embarrassment, and humiliation. Or so he thought. What he didn't anticipate was the way James handled the situation. Instead of panicking or retaliating, the guard remained calm, his posture unwavering despite the ferocity of the attack. Even when Brutus let out another guttural growl, circling him menacingly, James showed no sign of faltering. As the moments stretched on, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by murmurs of outrage from the crowd. People started pointing fingers at Victor, their voices rising in anger. "What kind of person does that?" One woman shouted, her tone laced with disgust. Another man shook his head, muttering, "This is disgusting. That poor soldier." Others joined in, condemning Victor's actions as cowardly and cruel. For the first time, Victor's confidence wavered. He hadn't planned for this, not the backlash, not the judgmental stares, and certainly not the way James refused to break character. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. As Brutus continued to snap and bark, pacing back and forth, James made a decision that would change everything. For himself, for Victor, and for everyone watching. As Brutus continued to pace and growl, his teeth flashing dangerously close to James' boots, the tension in the air reached a breaking point. The crowd was a mix of emotions. Some were horrified, others outraged, and many simply couldn't believe what they were witnessing. But amidst the chaos, James remained an anchor of calm. His breathing was steady, his posture unwavering, and his focus razor-sharp. Despite the ferocity of the dog lunging at him, something inside James clicked, a quiet resolve that guided his next move. Instead of maintaining the standoff with the bayonet, James did something unexpected. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle just enough to create space, not out of fear, but as a gesture of control. Then, in a voice so calm it almost seemed surreal, he spoke directly to Brutus. "Easy now," he said, his tone firm yet gentle, carrying an authority that cut through the noise around them. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was measured, almost soothing, as if he were speaking to an old friend rather than a snarling beast. The effect was immediate. Brutus froze mid-growl, his ears twitching as he processed the sound of James' voice. For a moment, the dog looked confused, its body language shifting from aggression to uncertainty. Sensing this change, James took another calculated step back, keeping eye contact with Brutus without showing any sign of hostility. He extended a gloved hand slightly, palm open, signaling peace instead of provocation. "Good boy," James murmured softly, his words steady and reassuring. "You're okay." To everyone watching, it felt like time stood still. No one dared to breathe as Brutus hesitated, his growls fading into low whimpers. Slowly, cautiously, the massive dog began to approach James, sniffing the air as if trying to understand the situation. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their earlier outrage giving way to awe. What had started as a terrifying attack was now transforming into something no one could have predicted, a moment of connection between man and beast. Finally, Brutus stopped just a few feet away from James, his tail beginning to wag tentatively. The once menacing creature now sat down at James' feet, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. It was as though the dog recognized the calm energy radiating from James, a stark contrast to the anger and tension emanating from Victor. James didn't pet the dog or make any sudden movements. He simply stood there, exuding patience and understanding. And in that moment, Brutus seemed to realize there was nothing to fear. The transformation was extraordinary, not just for Brutus, but for the entire scene. The crowd erupted into murmurs of disbelief, quickly followed by applause. Some people clapped enthusiastically, while others wiped away tears, moved by the display of grace under pressure. Even the police officers who had begun to push through the throng paused, momentarily taken aback by what they saw. Here was a soldier, standing guard outside Buckingham Palace, not only defending himself against a violent threat, but doing so with compassion and restraint. Victor, however, was far from impressed. His smug grin faltered as he watched the events unfold. This was not how it was supposed to go. In his mind, setting Brutus on James was supposed to humiliate the guard, to expose some perceived weakness or flaw. Instead, James had turned the situation on its head, showcasing qualities Victor could never comprehend: empathy, self-control, and dignity. As the cheers grew louder and the cameras flashed incessantly, Victor's face flushed red with embarrassment. His plan had backfired spectacularly, leaving him exposed as the villain in this unfolding drama. Unable to contain his frustration, Victor stormed forward, grabbing Brutus' leash roughly. "Come here," he barked, yanking the dog away from James. Brutus whimpered, clearly reluctant to leave the calm presence he'd found in the guard. But Victor wasn't interested in subtlety or kindness. He tugged the leash violently, dragging the dog behind him as he glared daggers at James. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "This is my dog. You had no right." James finally broke protocol, turning his head slightly to meet Victor's glare. His expression was unreadable, a blend of calmness and quiet strength, but his response silenced the angry man instantly. "Sir," James replied evenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "your dog isn't the problem here." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, there was complete silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then the crowd erupted again, this time with shouts of support for James. People began recording videos on their phones, capturing Victor's flushed face and defensive stance. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone," while another added, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Victor realized too late that he had miscalculated. What he intended as a personal vendetta had become a public spectacle, one that painted him as the aggressor and James as the hero. As the murmurs turned into chants of encouragement for the guard, Victor's confidence crumbled. He glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how outnumbered he was. The crowd wasn't just observing anymore. They were actively condemning him, their collective disapproval pressing down on him like a weight. And yet, even as the situation spiraled out of control, James returned to his post, resuming his position with the same stoic demeanor he'd maintained all along. To him, this wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about staying true to his duty and values. But little did he know, this encounter would ripple far beyond that autumn morning, sparking conversations and inspiring countless lives, including his own. Victor's face burned with humiliation as the crowd's disapproval washed over him like a tidal wave. His earlier bravado had crumbled into something uglier, anger mixed with desperation. He tugged Brutus closer to his side, gripping the leash so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The dog whimpered softly, clearly confused by the sudden shift in energy. Victor ignored it, his focus now entirely on James, who stood calmly at his post, seemingly unfazed by the chaos unfolding around him. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Victor snapped, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "This isn't over. You humiliated me in front of everyone. His words were laced with venom, but they lacked conviction. Even he could hear the waver in his tone, the cracks beginning to show beneath his veneer of superiority. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he held Victor's gaze steadily, his expression neutral yet commanding. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Sir," he said, enunciating each word carefully, "I didn't ask for this situation, but if there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that respect isn't given, it's earned. And it's not earned by fear or force." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing off the stone walls of Buckingham Palace. Some people clapped rhythmically, while others shouted words of encouragement. "Well said, soldier. And you tell him, lad." Victor flinched visibly under the weight of their collective judgment. For someone who prided himself on control and dominance, being publicly called out, and worse, condemned, was unbearable. He clenched his jaw, trying to muster some semblance of composure, but it was clear he was losing ground. Before Victor could retaliate further, a uniformed police officer pushed through the crowd, her presence commanding immediate attention. She was young but carried herself with authority, her eyes scanning the scene before landing squarely on Victor. "Sir, can I have a word with you?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Victor hesitated, glancing nervously between the officer, James, and the growing number of onlookers recording the encounter on their phones. "What's the problem here?" he demanded, attempting to sound indignant. "My dog got a little excited. That's all. Surely you're not going to make a fuss about nothing." The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his attempt to downplay the incident. "A little excited," she repeated, gesturing toward James, who still stood tall despite the ordeal. "That's not what I'm hearing from witnesses. Step aside, please. We need to discuss this further." Sensing that resistance would only make things worse, Victor reluctantly followed the officer to the edge of the courtyard, dragging Brutus along behind him. As they moved away, the crowd parted silently, their stares heavy with disapproval. A few people muttered under their breath, calling Victor names he couldn't ignore. One elderly woman shook her head and muttered loud enough for him to hear, "Shame on you." Another man pointed accusingly and said, "You should be locked up." Meanwhile, James resumed his position outside the palace gates, standing motionless once again as though nothing had happened. To anyone watching, he appeared completely unaffected by the drama that had just unfolded. But inside, his mind raced. He replayed the confrontation in his head, the snarls of the dog, the shouts of the crowd, Victor's hateful words, and wondered how such a simple morning could spiral so quickly into chaos. Still, he reminded himself why he chose this path: to serve, to protect, and to lead by example. Today, he had done exactly that. Back near the perimeter, the officer began questioning Victor, taking notes as several eyewitnesses stepped forward to share their accounts. One tourist recounted how Victor deliberately released Brutus, saying, "He looked right at the guard and said, 'Let's see how brave you are.'" Another described the terror in the air when the dog lunged at James, emphasizing how calm and composed the soldier remained throughout. Each testimony painted Victor as the aggressor, a man using his pet as a weapon to satisfy his own prejudices. As the evidence mounted against him, Victor grew increasingly agitated. "This is ridiculous," he protested, pacing back and forth. "I didn't do anything wrong. That guard provoked my dog." But his excuses fell flat, drowned out by the chorus of voices condemning his actions. Even Brutus seemed restless, sensing his master's unease and pulling anxiously at the leash. By the time the questioning ended, it was clear that Victor wouldn't walk away scot-free. The officer informed him that he'd be charged with endangerment and public disturbance, among other offenses. She also noted the racial undertones of his behavior, which would likely result in additional scrutiny. "You'll need to come down to the station later today," she told him, handing him a summons. "Until then, I suggest you keep your distance from the palace and its guards." Defeated and humiliated, Victor stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. The crowd watched him leave, some shaking their heads in disgust, others cheering loudly in support of James. As the tension eased, the atmosphere shifted. People approached James cautiously, thanking him for his bravery and offering kind words. One child even handed him a small British flag, saying shyly, "You're my hero." Though grateful for their praise, James remained humble. He nodded politely, offering quiet thanks without breaking protocol. Deep down, however, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the support, but for the reminder that compassion and integrity could triumph over hatred, even in the most unexpected moments. The days following the incident were a whirlwind for James Carter, though outwardly he remained as composed as ever. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire, fueled by videos shared on social media and headlines in newspapers across the country. Royal Guard calms raging dog amid racist attack, one article read, while another proclaimed, "Hero soldier shows grace under fire." People couldn't get enough of the story, a tale of courage, dignity, and humanity that stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of prejudice. Victor Langley's trial quickly became the talk of the town. Evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness testimonies, video footage from tourists' phones, and even security camera recordings from nearby buildings all painted a damning picture. During the proceedings, Victor tried to defend himself, claiming that releasing Brutus had been a misunderstanding and insisting that his actions weren't racially motivated. But the judge wasn't convinced. In her ruling, she described Victor's behavior as reckless, malicious, and deeply offensive, emphasizing the harm caused not only to James, but also to the public trust. By the end of the trial, Victor was found guilty on multiple charges, including endangerment, racial harassment, and public disturbance. He received a hefty fine and was sentenced to community service working with marginalized youth, an effort, the court explained, to help him confront and unlearn his prejudices. For James, life continued much as it always had. Despite the newfound attention, he returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace, standing tall and steadfast as if nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, things were different. Letters of gratitude poured in from around the world, many written by people who saw themselves in James, individuals who had faced discrimination or hardship, but drew inspiration from his example. Some letters came from parents, thanking him for being a role model for their children. Others were penned by veterans, commending him for upholding the values of honor and resilience. Even members of the royal family expressed their admiration. During a private ceremony, James was invited to tea at the palace, where he met with senior officials who praised his conduct. Though flattered by the recognition, James didn't see himself as extraordinary. In interviews, he spoke humbly about his upbringing, sharing how his journey had shaped him into the person he was today. "I grew up facing racism myself," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "There were times when I felt like giving up, like maybe I didn't belong. But my family taught me something important. They told me that true strength isn't about fighting back when someone tries to bring you down. It's about rising above it, showing them that hate can't win." His words resonated deeply with audiences, sparking conversations about race, respect, and the power of forgiveness. Schools began incorporating his story into lessons on empathy and leadership, while community organizations invited him to speak at events. James accepted some invitations, using these opportunities not to boast about his achievements, but to encourage others to embrace kindness and understanding. "We're all human," he often said, "and we all have the power to choose how we respond to adversity. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is also the right thing, but it's worth it." As weeks turned into months, James noticed subtle changes within the ranks of the Queen's Guard as well. Fellow soldiers approached him more frequently, seeking advice or simply expressing their admiration. Young recruits looked up to him, inspired by his ability to stay calm under pressure and handle conflict with grace. Recognizing his influence, James took on a mentoring role, guiding new members through the challenges of military life. He emphasized not just physical endurance and discipline, but also emotional intelligence, the importance of leading with integrity and treating others with respect. Meanwhile, Victor Langley struggled to adjust to his sentence. Working with marginalized youth forced him to confront perspectives vastly different from his own. At first, he resisted, dismissing the program as punishment rather than opportunity. But over time, something shifted. The young people he worked with were candid yet compassionate, challenging his biases without malice. Slowly, Victor began to see the world, and himself, through a different lens. It wasn't redemption, exactly, but it was a start. Back at Buckingham Palace, James stood tall once again, his presence a symbol of resilience and hope. Though he never sought fame, his actions reminded the world that heroes aren't defined by grand gestures or flashy titles. They're defined by moments of quiet courage, the decisions we make when no one is watching, and the lives we touch along the way. And in those moments, James Carter proved himself to be more than a. In the months that followed, James Carter found himself at the center of a quiet but profound transformation, not just in his own life, but in the lives of those around him. The incident with Victor Langley had opened doors he never expected, allowing him to step into a role far greater than that of a royal guard. He became a symbol of resilience and grace, someone people looked to for guidance during times of uncertainty. Though James remained humble, often deflecting praise and insisting he was simply doing his job, the impact of his actions rippled outward, inspiring countless individuals to reflect on their own values and choices. One of the most surprising aspects of this newfound attention was how it brought strangers together. Letters continued to pour in from all over the world, some written by children who drew pictures of James standing tall against Brutus, others penned by elderly veterans recounting their own struggles with prejudice. One letter stood out in particular. It came from a young girl named Emily, who wrote about being bullied at school for her accent. "When I saw what you did," she said, "I realized I don't have to let mean words hurt me. You showed me that staying calm and kind is stronger than fighting back." Enclosed with her letter was a small hand-drawn portrait of James, wearing his bearskin hat with a faint smile on his face. Moved by her words, James kept the drawing pinned inside his locker as a reminder of why his actions mattered. The story also sparked meaningful conversations within the Queen's Guard itself. While the regiment was known for its discipline and tradition, James' experience highlighted the importance of empathy and emotional strength. During training sessions, senior officers began incorporating discussions about handling difficult situations, not just physical threats, but moments requiring patience and understanding. James often participated in these talks, sharing insights gained from years of overcoming personal challenges. Being a guard isn't just about protecting a building or following orders, he told recruits. It's about representing something bigger than yourself. Every action we take reflects on our team, our country, and our values. Outside of work, James embraced opportunities to connect with communities beyond the palace gates. Schools invited him to speak at assemblies, where he shared stories of perseverance and encouraged students to stand up for themselves and others. Community centers hosted events featuring James as a guest speaker, eager to hear firsthand how he maintained composure under pressure. His message was always simple yet powerful. We can't control everything that happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. Kindness costs nothing, but it changes everything. Meanwhile, Victor Langley's journey towards self-reflection continued, albeit slowly. His mandatory community service placed him in environments he might otherwise have avoided: youth centers, shelters, and outreach programs designed to bridge divides between different groups. At first, Victor resisted, viewing the experience as punishment rather than growth. But over time, he began to see glimpses of humanity he hadn't noticed before. Working alongside teenagers from diverse backgrounds, many of whom faced hardships unimaginable to him, forced Victor to confront his own biases. One pivotal moment came when a teenager named Marcus approached him after a workshop. Marcus, who wore a hoodie and carried a sketchpad everywhere, asked bluntly, "Why do you hate people so much?" The question caught Victor off guard, leaving him speechless. For days afterward, he replayed the conversation in his mind, realizing how deeply rooted his prejudices were, and how destructive they had been. Though change didn't come overnight, Victor started taking small steps toward accountability, attending counseling sessions, and volunteering more willingly. As winter gave way to spring, James returned to his post outside Buckingham Palace, standing tall beneath the changing skies. Life seemed to settle into a rhythm once again, though nothing felt quite the same. The lessons learned, from both triumphs and failures, had left an indelible mark on everyone involved. For James, the experience reinforced his belief in leading with compassion. For Victor, it marked the beginning of a long road toward redemption. And for the countless witnesses who watched the drama unfold, it served as a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there is always room for courage, kindness, and hope. Though James never sought recognition, his story became a testament to the power of choosing dignity over division. In a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, he reminded people that true strength lies not in dominance, but in the ability to rise above hatred, and in doing so, inspire others to do the same. As time passed, the story of James Carter and Victor Langley became more than just a fleeting moment in the news cycle. It evolved into a lasting narrative that resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. It wasn't just about a royal guard calming a dog or confronting racism. It was about the choices individuals make when faced with adversity, and how those choices ripple outward to shape the world around them. For James, this realization came gradually, as he witnessed firsthand the impact his actions had on others. One crisp spring morning, as James stood outside Buckingham Palace, he noticed a familiar figure approaching him, a young woman holding a bouquet of flowers. At first, he didn't recognize her, but as she drew closer, he realized it was Emily, the girl who had sent him the heartfelt letter months earlier. Now standing before him in person, she smiled shyly and handed him the flowers. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You helped me believe I can be brave too." James knelt slightly to meet her gaze, offering her a warm smile. "The bravery is all yours," he replied. "I'm just glad I could remind you of what you already have inside." Moments like these reinforced James' belief in the power of small acts of kindness. Though his encounter with Brutus and Victor had been dramatic, it was the quieter, everyday interactions that truly defined his legacy. Whether it was mentoring new recruits, speaking at schools, or simply offering a reassuring nod to a struggling stranger, James understood that leadership wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistency and authenticity. His ability to remain calm under pressure, coupled with his unwavering commitment to compassion, inspired those around him to strive for better versions of themselves. For Victor, the journey toward redemption remained challenging but transformative. After completing his community service, he chose to stay involved with the youth center where he'd worked, volunteering his time to mentor troubled teens. Though he still grappled with feelings of guilt and shame, he found solace in helping others navigate their own struggles. One day, while leading a group discussion, a teenager asked him directly, "Do you regret what you did?" Victor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Every day," he admitted. "But regret isn't enough. What matters is what I do next." The room fell silent, and for the first time, Victor felt a flicker of hope, not for forgiveness, but for progress. Back at the palace, James continued to serve with quiet pride, embodying the values he held dear. Promoted to corporal, he took on additional responsibilities, including overseeing training programs for incoming guards. He emphasized not only physical endurance and discipline, but also the importance of empathy and emotional intelligence. "Our uniforms don't define us," he often told recruits. "It's our character that earns respect, and our actions that leave a mark." By summer, James' story had reached even greater heights, inspiring books, documentaries, and even a short film celebrating his courage. Yet despite the accolades, James remained grounded, focusing on the work ahead rather than basking in past achievements. To him, true success wasn't measured by titles or recognition. It was measured by the lives he touched along the way. As the sun set over London one evening, casting golden hues across the palace grounds, James paused to reflect on everything that had transpired. From the chaos of that autumn morning to the lessons learned in its aftermath, he realized that life rarely followed a straight path. Challenges would always arise, moments of doubt would linger, and people would continue to make mistakes. But within each challenge lay an opportunity for growth, for connection, and for change. Standing tall beneath the shadow of the palace, James felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for fame or fortune, but for the chance to serve as a beacon of hope in a world often clouded by division. Heroes weren't born, he reminded himself. They were made through countless decisions to choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, and love over hate. And in choosing grace under fire, James Carter proved that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a movement, leaving behind a legacy far greater than any title or uniform ever could.